Hello and welcome on behalf of the Museum of Art and Photography and the Bangalore International Center. Today's talk, Traditions and Transitions, the Kalamkari Through Time, launches MAP's new theme, Creative Connections, planned for the months of August and September. The histories of the Kalamkari reveal an amalgamation of a diverse set of influences. Designs were developed not only in response to the visual traditions of the region, but also the needs of the different markets that they were produced for. Kalamkaris continue to be created even today, making them an unbroken, if evolving tradition for over 500 years now. Known for their vibrant designs, their use of natural colors, and ingenious techniques, they are today an intrinsic part of India's textile heritage. I'm delighted, therefore, to welcome two experts on the subject, Peter Lee and Renuka Reddy, to guide us through these histories of the Kalamkari, connecting the traditional to the contemporary and India to the world. Renuka Reddy is a textile artist whose work is steeped in exploring the form and heritage of the Kalamkari. As she describes it, her work is a series of experiments primarily addressing one question: is it possible to produce an 18th century quality chintz even today? Peter Lee is a fellow collector and a dear friend, a man who dons many hats, researcher and scholar, author, curator, and philanthropist. But through all his roles, his work is primarily focused on documenting and preserving heritage. He has an incredible and extensive collection of textiles with a focus on the Kalamkari, sourced from all over the world, which I can't help but covet. It is very exciting, therefore, that today we will get a chance to see some of the amazing works in his collection, as well as from Renuka's studio and other sources as they take us through their journeys. We are also thrilled that as an additional bonus, they will also look at a few select textiles from the MAP collection and unpack some of their secrets for us. Now, without further ado, let me hand it over to Renuka.
So Peter and I, we met in person as recent as only last year, even though we'd heard of each other and the kind of work that we did in our respective fields. It was actually Abhishek and Amit Jain from MAP who connected us. And since then, we've been having this running conversation about Kalamkari, and it's been terrific for me because every time Peter would send me an image or some information, it almost always I've had to take a step back and look at what I know. So it's brought in some great insights. For example, we have this ongoing debate, what can be considered fine work in Kalamkari, and it really raises a lot of questions. So thanks to MAP and BIC for organizing this. I'm really pleased to have another conversation with Peter today. A little bit about what I do. I started working with Kalamkari about 10 years ago. There were many facets of Kalamkari that I found extremely inspiring. I think I recall one of the first things that made me want to work with Kalamkari is just how beautiful the historic textiles are. Can I have the first slide, Shilpa? So the color palette, so bright and I think really delicate at the same time. I've really yet to see a garish piece in till today. The composition of whimsical and almost unbelievable flora, the very mischievous animals. Can I go to the next slide? Next slide, Shilpa. So on the left side, even motifs like the flame motifs. Can we go back? Yes, thank you. Or Rama battling away with Ravana. I think they all evoke such a strong sensorial response. And personally for me, I think it had a lot to do with the painterly quality of these textiles, which is quite different from woven textiles. Can we stop the screen, Shilpa? So I started reading and learning more about the history, and that was another facet which I found extremely fascinating, because here's this textile. We do not know when it originated in India, and quite possibly thousands of years ago. It became the currency of international trade because countries like Indonesia, when they bartered for spices, they did not want gold, but they wanted Indian textiles. These textiles also led to the establishment of European East India companies. And this had such a far-reaching ripples from the possible industrial revolution to the more infamous and tragic African slavery. And undoubtedly, Kalamkari textiles had huge political consequences. But what I'd really like to focus on is, to me, Kalamkari textiles are a proof of conversation between different cultures, which is almost very romantic. Now that I was thoroughly obsessed with these textiles, I decided to work with Kalamkari and work with the traditional craftsmen to get these textiles made. And unfortunately, that did not work out. So I started reading about the techniques and primarily referring to 18th century accounts, which were written by travelers who came to India at that time. And this was a real turning point in my life, because it was not my intention to actually start painting Kalamkari textiles. That kind of came about. And as I studied the textile, the techniques more and more, I realized the process of Kalamkari production is extremely complex, at least before the discovery of synthetic dyes in 1856. Now, here's a fun fact about synthetic dyes. The first synthetic dye was accidentally discovered by an 18-year-old William Perkins in 1856 when he was trying to make quinine, which was used to treat malaria. He, of course, went on to patent it and made a huge fortune out of it. I mention this because I realized that every step of Kalamkari production is based on an incredible discovery by an unknown person. And I won't get into step by step of making Kalamkari process, but I really wanted to highlight the steps that made me want to work in this medium. Can I have the next slide? The one before. Number 3, Shilpa.
Yeah, this one.
So this is one of the first features that I thought was quite amazing, the fact that cotton cloth was treated with buffalo milk, because the fat in the milk basically gave properties to the cloth that one could draw with water-like mordants and without spreading. I mean, if you think about it, this is such an important property for painted textiles. So, next slide, please. When it comes to colors, class of dyes such as madder dyes do not have an affinity to bond with cotton. And it needs what's called a mordant or a metallic salt, which basically bonds with cotton and bonds with the dye molecule. What amazes me is that someone figured out the necessity of a mordant, and not only the requirement of a mordant, but also that different combinations and proportions of mordants such as alum or iron can give a variety of colors from a single dye path. So, for example, in this piece, all the colors except yellows and blues would have been generated from a single dye path. Next slide, please. The third feature that I really find remarkable is also the use of resist. I guess the use of resist in itself is not so remarkable because it has been used in different regions before. What I find remarkable is that not only was the know-how existing at that time to draw extremely fine lines in wax, but the know-how also existed in covering large areas with wax and then dyeing the whole cloth without cracks developing in the wax. Next slide. The next slide is one of my favorites. So in the process, cloth is dyed in madder, and that causes the background of the cloth to get this reddish tint that you see on the left side. And to get rid of it, cloth was soaked in dung from either sheep or goat, cow, and then it was exposed to sunlight for days and weeks. And this basically got rid of the cloth, got rid of the reddish tint, or rather it bleached the non-painted or non-mordanted areas into white. And I would have thought that, dung could have been used to bleach the cloth. Again, I find this really amazing. So the entire process, I realized on practice that it's not only a culmination of amazing discoveries, but also extremely efficient. So before working with Kalamkari, I had worked with Indian traditional crafts of India, and then had moved on to work with automotive textiles. So I basically worked for a company which made car interiors, and my job was to assess the properties of cover materials, such as textiles, leather, PVC, basically to understand how the materials and properties affected efficiency of production. And I know this is going to sound absolutely absurd comparing automotive production to Kalamkari production, but coming from that background, I can't help but notice how efficient the process is, where every material and sequence has a role to play, and oftentimes multiple roles to play. So I think these clever practices, based entirely on empirical knowledge passed down through centuries and generations, they allowed great versatility in design and also gave properties to the end product that made them so sought over around the world. Also, practicing these techniques, it kind of made me think about what must have gone into the mind of historic craftsmen. It kind of gave me a glimpse into their mind. They must have been really curious about the natural world around them, and the ingenuity in using these materials, not only to build, but sustain one of the most significant practices from India. So I would say my focus of work has been to understand the techniques and process pretty much. So for the last 10 years, it has been mostly researching and experimenting in this medium. And there were certain milestones that helped me gauge the progress the progress of my work. Can I have the next slide? I guess so. You will see, the parallels between the features that I thought were amazing and my progress. So in the first one is, the first thing I had to figure out was, how do I dye a textile in natural dyes such that despite being exposed to sunlight, and like this piece has been exposed to sunlight for about 3 weeks, how do I retain the bright colors considering, the general impression of natural dyes is that they fade very quickly. So this was one milestone for me. The second one was to be able to draw in wax the very fine lines which are so characteristic of historic Kalamkari. So in this particular piece, the white dots that you see in the white flower are wax resist, and the fine lines that you see, say in the vase, again, were drawn in wax and painted over with the mordant. Next slide, please. And my current focus of research is basically, how can I wax, paint wax on a cloth and be able to dye in an indigo vat without cracks. So in this particular piece, the white lines that you see in the blue areas have been painted in wax, and all the non-blue areas have been painted in wax as well. And then the whole piece was dipped in an indigo vat. Again, this is a small piece, so my next challenge is to be able to do bigger pieces and still not have the cracks, but get those beautiful indigos. So I think I've made some progress in understanding this process through experimentation and research, but I must admit there are times when I feel like I've barely scratched the surface, which is perhaps a good thing because, then there's a lot more to learn. So that's about my work, and I will hand over to Peter.
Thank you very much, Renuka. And I presume everyone can hear me. Um, Firstly, thank you very much, Abhishek, for hosting this, and also to the Bangalore International Center. It's actually been quite exciting to sort of prepare for this. And for me, of course, the main sort of bonus is having this continued chat with Renuka. I was sort of blown away when I learned that Renuka sort of came into Kalamkari through textile technology for cars. Mainly, I was so humbled by that, mainly because for me, I came into Kalamkari through shopping for my mother, from a totally sort of consumer bimbo kind of angle. I literally was looking for batik, Indonesian batiks for my mother. And through that, I started to become very fascinated by this quality of, resist-dyed cotton. And then through that to the ancestry of Indonesian batik. And that invariably led me to Indian trade textiles. And what I was finding in Indonesia just completely blew my mind away. And I had to rethink everything I knew about Indonesian batik. And there were so many things that are so closely related. Unfortunately, in Indonesia, people don't really like to look at the two things together. So batik collectors do not collect Indonesian trade textiles. And they're seen as quite separate disciplines. In fact, most Indonesian collectors of batik don't seem interested in the Kalamkaris at all, which is rather unfortunate. And through my interest in the Kalamkaris that appeared in Indonesia, I became fascinated by the whole trade in this. So, I soon discovered that it was traded all over the world. And together with my mother, who, loved beautiful textiles, we formed this collection. So our sort of mom and pop home style collection. I hate to say stamp collecting, but I became slightly obsessed with this way of collecting. I had to have, interesting examples from all the different markets. But I think looking sort of beyond that sort of so-called stamp collecting approach, there's so many interesting stories with that sort of come up when we think of Kalamkari. First of all, to me, it's the world's first global commercial textile. I mean, that is just so mind-blowing. The technical ingenuity, which Renuka mentioned earlier, not only of the material, but of the processes, allowed an extremely high level of product flexibility. Therefore, a wide range of patterns and designs could be made to suit any market. I think that in itself is so interesting. So therefore, producers could churn out, masses of cheap block printed cottons to, really small quantities of the finest examples. So the range is also the other exceptional kind of fact that makes Kalamkari so special. And the other thing that really fascinates me about Kalamkari is how, because it involves drawing, I believe it emerged as a copy. The first patterns were imitations of woven patterns. But soon enough, it sort of became, it sort of flew away in its own direction, and we start to see patterns that have no relation to woven pattern. And, it really goes beyond the most sort of abstract designs and as far as human imagination could take a textile. So, and often it's surprising how unique or creative or so-called modern some of these textiles could be. I also think it's important, Kalamkari is important because it's sort of a signifier of cultural exchange. We see so many stories, we can tell so many stories through these very odd, often clash or encounters of design and pattern and influence all in one textile. So there are endless stories in each sort of cloth, which in effect becomes like a canvas or painting in itself. I thought to just run through at this point, this sort of stamp collecting perspective in the family collection, if I may share screen. The collection is named after my late parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lee Kip Lee. It is based in Singapore. Anyone who wants to come and see, please let me know. We have this group of textiles, maybe numbering now about 400 to 500 pieces. And the collection encompasses kalamkaris and block prints for Europe, Iran, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Thailand, and Japan. The pieces for Europe, we have hangings like palampors. So this is one rare example we found just last year. It's sort of gold, gilded and very carefully painted with a white background. It's very huge, about 3 by 4 meters. And we have a detail on the right showing, you know, all the, you might see it as fine yellow lines, but all that is gold leaf. The entire piece is gold leafed. Dresses, I have quite a small selection of 18th century dresses. This is also from the 18th century. Interestingly, the drawing on this fascinates me. A Chinese calligrapher friend of mine said it resonated very much with Chinese style painting. And I was also speculating with another collector of Armenian descent who sort of suggests that there might have been other centers, and could Batavia also have been somewhere where Kalamkari was produced through sort of multiple or multinational investors? Could there have been Chinese artisans in some of these Kalamkari centers, even in India? I mean, these is pure speculation, but if you look at the sort of drawing style on the left, it's slightly different from the typical Kalamkaris we know. But anyway, one of the joys of this subject is there's so much still that we can learn, and it's fun to speculate now anyway. This is 18th century, second half of the 18th century. It's a men's vest, French. I'm fascinated with this background. It's Renuka showed an example of it earlier. It's known in Dutch trade records as salpicado or salt splashed, and you have this wonderful kind of speckled background effect. It's not really dotted by hand, but sprayed somehow. Then we have pieces for the Persian market, like this jacket here, of a style that we know typical of the kind of kalamkaris that were made in Masulipatam. Another example of a piece for the Persian market, Iranian market. This is a big square. I'm not sure what it might have been used for. Somebody might be able to tell me. Again, with gold leaf. A rather unusual piece for the Nepalese market. These long hangings would have been just reused. It might not have been made for this purpose, but Tibetan and Nepalese temples often reused old material for temple hangings, perhaps behind a Buddha or just to line the wall for ceremonies. With a typical sort of Nepalese stupa with the eyes. Apparently a piece like this was carbon dated to the 15th century, but you know, on looking at it, it looks sort of 19th century. So I'm not really sure about that carbon date, but anyway, it's again, a lot of work needs to be done in this area. This is a rather bad picture, but for, you know, this is a Kalamkari for the Sri Lankan market with its characteristic sort of sawtooth ends like we see for Indonesia and Thailand. This is another poor detail, but we see here the sort of rows of spiky ends. Another detail. And here's another piece for the Sri Lankan market, and you can see these characteristics of rows of sort of sawtooth edges. And the Thai pieces for the Thai market have these same ends here. This piece is also gold leafed, and they're long. They're about over 2 to 3 meters long. And of course, the unique pieces for the characteristic pieces for the Thai market have these sort of divine beings, heavenly beings, which show you how specialized the work was, or the designs were for the Thai or Siamese market, which started from the Ayutthaya period, so 17th to 18th century, right up to Ratanakosin, so up to the early 19th century. Indonesia is fascinating. So this is the period I love best. This is a patchwork robe donated by my family to the Asian Civilizations Museum. It is an incredible sort of encyclopedia or inventory of trade cloths that pass through Indonesia. You can see it has brocade, it has interesting sort of sarasas or kalamkaris just with black and white, imitation checks, some kinkabs or brocades from India, Gujarat perhaps, check cloth from Indonesia or India, and stripes as well. And here we see this incredible, well, I would say in Nusantara, Indonesia, this voracious demand for pattern cloth. And we see the development of pattern on pattern, pattern with pattern, and the most sort of strange psychedelic geometric patterns coming up, like on the right, to drawn versions of 18th century bizarre silk. I think, you know, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. There's a whole story about bizarre silks emerging, sort of woven patterns emerging in France. And which came first? Were the Kalamkaris the copies of the bizarre silks, or the bizarre silks copies of the Kalamkaris? But they're really surreal. And they have sort of flora, fauna, and all thrown together in an abstract, surreal way. And these are examples of the kind of the varieties of check patterns for the Indonesian market and imitation checks. I think this really fascinates me, the love and the passion for not just real checks. I mean, that you could easily get, but this aesthetic for appreciating imitation woven designs. And this kind is unique to Eastern Indonesia. They were traded to Flores, Ambon, to the easternmost islands of Indonesia. I haven't found them anywhere else, and they're characterized by these very unique and extremely finely drawn lace-like borders, as well as very complicated and fine central patterns, which you can see. Yeah, and basically just the idea of pattern on pattern, which we see in these big diamond-shaped cloths. So we'll talk about that later. But what's fascinating for Indonesia is how you start to see combinations of patterns, which to me is, now we think of this sort of idea as something completely modern, but it existed on Indonesian textiles from, at least 17th century. And then finally, for the Japanese market, we see in Japan, through Hirado and Nagasaki, the Dutch brought very fine and interesting examples, which over time, they were even saved and made into patchwork and as fragments even, not only for clothing, but for the tea ceremony, where they would have been used for cloth pouches, for tea utensils like teapots, and these are tea canisters. And fragments were saved into, scrapbooks. This was an elegant pastime for tea lovers. These would be called curator kagamis. It became sort of a scholarly pastime to save these very rare examples of Indian textiles that came into Japan through Nagasaki and Hirado. And that's it. And I end with this amazing patchwork piece. Again, it shows you how this ongoing aesthetic with the multiplicity of patterns all in one cloth.
All right. So before Peter and I start looking at some of the pieces together, I wanted to make a quick clarification about the term Kalamkari. Though Kalamkari literally means pen work, but just like chins was used by the English and pintaros, which actually means painted, used by the Portuguese, it was often referred to both printed and painted cotton. So today we'll be looking at both techniques. Also, a quick note about domestic production. While the export industry was thriving, so was the domestic production. And the kind of textiles that came out were, fabric for clothing, wall hangings for secular and religious purposes, floor spreads, tent cloth, and other objects. Looking at Peter's extensive collection, you can see how varied the design repertoire was, and it kind of makes me think that long before the term mass customization was coined, I think as recent as 1987, I think it's clear that this concept was well in place in the production of Kalamkari, and because they were able to cater to individuals, courts, countries, and it seems like specific product preferences were very well established, and so then one wonders. What drove these product preferences? And I guess it has to do something with the multi-purpose role of these textiles that they played in society, from utilitarian to ceremonial and ritual life of most Asian societies, as signifiers of rank, as bearers of social messages such as weddings or funeral. So for the purpose of this talk, because Kalamkari went to so many different cultures. Peter had this brilliant idea that we would look only the ones that went to Indonesia. Also because MAP has a wonderful collection of these textiles, so we could look at them specifically and comment on, what factors could have influenced those particular textiles that came into Indonesia. So we can start with the first one. And Peter, I'll follow your lead because you're the expert in this, and then maybe we could comment together on that.
Yeah, well, I thought it'd be nice to sort of look chronologically and and look at sort of the early textiles. And what's really fascinating with the pieces that have ended up in Indonesia, of course, is that many of the earliest pieces correlate to what was found in archaeological digs in Egypt. I think for start is the most famous. Although interestingly, I think Dr. Ruth Barnes has informed us that actually none of the Fostat pieces from Egypt were actually documented to have been found in Fostat. They were all found in the marketplace in Cairo and stuff like that. But I think subsequent to that, there have been digs in Berenike, I think it's called, which have been carbon dated. And I think we have much more assurance that they were really, found on site. And many of the patterns from these very early pieces correlate to surviving, and those that were found in Egypt were all just small fragments. And what we found in Indonesia are complete lengths. Some people actually are not 100% convinced that these are that old. but they have been carbon dated. So, it really depends if you believe in the carbon dates. I think stylistically, it makes sense that these are early. And so this is one of the classic block prints with the Hamza or the motif of the goose that have been found mostly in Sulawesi, I think, if not exclusively in Sulawesi, in several small communities, especially in the Toraja region. Yeah, maybe Renuka has some views on technique
Well, what I find interesting about this one is that, like you mentioned, the ones that were found in Fostad, I think some were dated 1400 and the ones in Indonesia were dated 1500. So we're almost saying 100 years when the same identical textile design was used. And because it was found in two different regions, Peter, do you think that in this particular instance, this design was not catering to a particular market, but it was something that was coming out of, I think, Gujarat at that time? And it was in general, attractive to the markets and probably not customized to that particular market, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know so little about it, but obviously, yes, since they are, the patterns are so similar, we don't really have a sense of specialization yet at this period.
I guess one thing it does confirm is that, these textiles were very well integrated into the trading system. I guess that's definitely one thing that these textiles, like the one found in Egypt and Sulawesi being so identical, establish the role of textile in the trade.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to comment about this is I've come across, I think, two other identical pieces where two of them were modern dyed block printed, but the one in the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., the description for that actually says it is resist stamped and dyed, which is, different. So again, it would be interesting to study both of them and why would one choose, which technique. So for future studies.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, it's resist as well, isn't it? It's resist block printed, like a batik.
I'm not so sure because this could have been done with just modern printing as well.
I see. So the block would have been the red parts.
Yes.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to study the textile up close. The next slide. Should we move to the next slide?
Yeah, I mean the so-called dancing ladies group also range in age, I believe. So some of them have been carbon dated quite early, also to the, I believe, 14th century. And talking about, as you mentioned, the longevity of these designs, I think some of them even go up to the 15th, 16th, possibly even 17th century. And the thing is, I believe, though, these are mostly found in Sulawesi as well. I'm not sure, I don't believe that there have been some examples of this found in Egypt, for example. And nowhere else. So, well, they only survived.
And is there something that's really significant of, the female?
Yeah, I mean, the design itself, again, correlates. I think people have drawn comparisons, I believe, with Jain drawings of the same period. And I who knows, but I can't imagine it has any immediate significance for the communities in Sulawesi. I mean, I as in like something that they would have specially commissioned. But for some reason, they only seem to survive in Sulawesi. Yeah.
Should we move to the next slide?
Yeah, again, I thought it was interesting to show, this is a patola, so double ikat, which mostly came from Patan. So again, these are the standard sort of wisdoms we know. And it just fascinates me that Patan is so far inland, and it seemed to be this big production center far inland from Gujarat, and it would have been, I mean, even to drive there takes hours from Ahmedabad, let alone the old days through like through a cart. And the fact that so much was made there for export. And what seems really interesting is that I've been looking at a lot of Malay sources, Malay manuscripts, and you see references to patolas in very early manuscripts. So obviously there was this huge demand for this cloth from Gujarat. So it's one of those key things for the Indonesian market. And we know they have survived a lot in Eastern Indonesia as well, together with the Kalamkaris. And often in some of these islands, they're worn together. And then early 19th century, early photography from the 1860s, which you see communities from these islands wearing patolas. And as well as it became very much of a Javanese court culture. So we see the rulers and the princesses or the queens dressed in patola, or might have some aspect of patola. It could have been a pair of trousers or a sash. But you often see this in court costume for Yogyakarta and Surakarta. So again, this idea of how Kalamkaris or block prints, anyway in this case, I believe that the earliest examples, obviously the first thing you do is imitate a woven pattern, and for kind of genealogical and stylistic reasons, these are so important. I mean, conceptually anyway, for me, that we see so many types of imitation patolas. And also the thing that I think is key when we look at the other textiles is this sort of like wonderful grid pattern that sort of looks like it's sort of interlocking, fancy interlocking sort of grid.
Peter, do you think that, this particular one especially, which is an imitation patola, did it ever get incorporated into local textiles?
Yes, definitely. Robin Maxwell, Sari to Sarong, and even her books before that, I think she's drawn that connection very well between, I mean, the influence of the patola pattern in Indonesia, and we see many kinds of indigenous or local weavings in Indonesia, which clearly reference the patola. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, these I thought, typical of the Indonesian market, pieces for the Indonesian market. So they're characterized by the sawtooth ends, both sides, but only usually just one layer, unlike for the pieces for Indonesia, for Sri Lanka and Thailand, where you might see up to 3 layers. I understand that for Thailand, the more layers, the higher rank in the palace you were. But for Indonesia, the preference was just for these 1 layers of sawtooth ends, and
Mm-hmm.
see this immediately and directly in batiks as well. So the connection is direct. But here, I love this how that sort of interlocking grid has become this endless knot thing. And Renuka, we had this discussion here.
Yes, when I see this textile, I mean, as a maker, my first reaction is, they're obviously repeats. Why weren't these made, at least the outline, printed in block print? Because one of the most time consuming is actually the drawing of the outlines more than the filling itself. So, I mean, look at the scale of that textile. It really, begs the question, why wasn't this block printed, the outlines at least, and why did they choose to hand paint it, hand draw the outlines as well? Do you think the the patrons, or in Indonesia, were very much sensitive about, or they were quite conscious of the difference between block print and hand painted?
Yeah, well, the Dutch records are incredibly interesting for the amount of detail they give in terms of, from the 17th and 18th century, in terms of, what the demand was from island to island. And sometimes this pattern in green wouldn't sell, but, only in red and blue. And on another island, they only wanted the same pattern, but only in red, or, so the specialization that the Dutch got involved in was incredible. And I believe there was a lot of illegal, called private trade by the British, Arab, Indian merchants, and even the Chinese at the same time. So, it's anybody's guess how, but I do believe that there was a strong preference for hand-drawn pieces. And I know that even for batik, right up to the 19th century, the Dutch tried to make imitation batik and with roller printed versions, and those just did not sell. So, they all ended up as dead stock. And apparently that's how, and then they started to offload in other markets. And apparently Africa was one of the destinations for these so-called unwanted Indonesian market pieces. So, there really was a strong eye and demand for hand-drawn pieces. And Renuka, we had this conversation about, I do agree that, in general, the impression is that pieces made for Indonesia are sort of rough and kind of crude. When you first look at the material, compared to the fine pieces made for Europe, right? Mm-hmm. But we had this amazing conversation. I thought that in terms of the amount of time, in a way, they almost remind me of Ming porcelain, which has a kind of rough and ready and dynamic, but very lively work. And as you noted, why make a whole piece like that, not with a block? Why draw? It's so time consuming, right? And the interesting thing you mentioned about the very fine kalamkaris was the thread count. Maybe you could also tell us.
Yes, I think a lot of the kalamkaris that went into the West, and of course there were a lot of different varieties as well, but I must say that all the exemplary ones that I've seen were always made out of extremely fine yarn, but very, very tight weave. And I think that was, and I think that's necessary to be able to do fine work. So perhaps that's why the difference in cloth selection that went into the West versus what went into the East. And perhaps Indonesians were not that, maybe sensitive to the kind of cloth, but maybe they cared more about that it met their design preferences.
Yeah. So the thinking was that the very fine, the very loose weaves was a preference, maybe because of the weather, and to compensate in terms of technique, you had to have kind of less fine designs, but maybe more complicated work throughout. So that was one. But so the map collection has these amazing sort of big pieces, double pieces, which were known as kain geba or in trade records, and dodots. But they're bigger than a double bedspread. And again, with this sort of rough and ready, but dynamic and vibrant, but completely pattern-filled cloths. The next one. And culminating in these, I think every collector has to have one of these sunburst versions of the dodot. But here, I think the key thing, again, the background is this very strange resist work, which we see, like these fine sort of net-like designs that fill the background. I think it's perhaps a way to add value to the piece. You can't do very fine patterns, so you do these complicated, large, looser background patterns. Next one. And more on just the idea of the huge variety of geometric patterns that we see for Indonesia here.
So Peter, I put this one in because I was really curious to hear from you. You know how you can see in the sawtooth area and also the area above it, you know, on the left to the center one, on the left one, you see this checked lines with in red, and on the right one, you see the texture in blue resis, which is the same background as the sunburst one. So I wanted to ask you, and it seems like the textures are more prevalent in these pieces, say, than the ones that went into the West or other textiles.
Yeah.
Why this, why this focus on textures? Was there something more to it?
I mean, it's something which we see resonating in batik today. Background patterns are incredibly important. In batik, we call it isen, which is sort of the filler patterns. And the pieces for Indonesia, we see quite often a full range of them. Sometimes the pieces that ended up in Europe, the chintzes, we see also interesting filler patterns, but you don't see the variety you see for Indonesia. And again, maybe it was a way to compensate value when you can't really do a very fine drawing. You just fill up with all this sort of dynamic, sort of roughly drawn patterns. But again, it's still a lot of work. It
is, because they're not block printed, and some of them are resis dyed or hand drawn. So it would have taken a lot of time.
Yeah. Okay, next one. I think we have to wrap up. So I think this one was just to show that, right? This is a piece from my collection, our collection, but this crazy background of resist sort of, I don't know what, wave or whirlpool, concentric rings design. This is two-sided, so it's really crazy. I mean, it is two-sided, right?
Yeah, I thought of the notion for a long time until I think I'm convinced it is double-sided. Well, the blue would be double-sided anyway, because just by virtue of the way it's dyed in a bath, so it would have taken a color on both sides. But the reds are clearly painted on both sides. I must say that I've only seen one Kalamkari from the West, which was actually painted on two sides, and I have I would really love to see this one in real, because we've heard of double-sided block prints, but double-sided hand-painted Kalamkaris really are really amazing to even hear.
Just to end, that piece, it's so interesting. Double-sided pieces were so important for the Indonesian market, so much so that it became part of sort of a metaphor. So in Malay, we say kain cit dua muka. So it's a chintz with two faces. Of course, it became a term for somebody, a double-faced, two-faced person, but the idea of the imagery of a two-sided Kalamkari sort of has persisted till today. Yeah. And you, Renuka, you picked this piece?
Yes, yes. I picked this piece because, one, of course, it's a more figurative one, which is, I guess, not too common in the Indonesian textiles that went into Indonesia. But I also picked this one because there are at least two other pieces that I've seen, one at the V&A and one at the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum. And what fascinates me is that they are exactly identical, right down to the dismembered body parts, and as well as the size. So then one wonders, was there a stencil for this, or was it copied, from visually copied onto the cloth?
Yeah.
And I know how visually they look so different, say, from the square hand-drawn samples. But really, as a maker, if I'm going to copy something, I wonder, is there a difference, say, between making this and a very geometric design? I mean, it's just a thought as a maker that maybe they're not so different, even though they look so different.
Yeah.
So I think that was the last slide of the map collection. And I just wanted to quickly comment on current day Kalamkari. And I think in the spirit of its history, I think Kalamkari continues to, evolve, meeting different market needs. as well as a medium for artistic expression. So on the left one is the left picture, top left picture shows Kalamkari block prints that are exported to the US today. And the one on the right, of course, is your traditional storytelling of mythological themes. The bottom left one is the dupatta with motifs, which are now considered very typical of Kalhasti designs. And the kurta next to it is by designer Gaurang Shah, where he's using these figurative elements to adorn a kurta. The one next to that is a wonderful tree of life by artist J. Niranjan, and the one next to it, right top, is by artist Ajit Kumar Das, where he interprets Pichwai paintings, elements of Pichwai painting in Kalamkari technique. And the bottom one is, again, it's very interesting to me because it's clearly a screen printed fabric which is marketed as Kalamkari. And I find this interesting because here, I mean, clearly motifs and not the techniques of Kalamkari. And it kind of reminds me when the Dutch started printing imitation patola and they started selling it in Indonesia until the 1950s, and it was kind of called the Indian textile. So maybe history is repeating itself in that sense. In terms of technique, I do see a departure from historic process. For example, wax resist is no longer, to my knowledge, used in South Indian Kalamkaris. Synthetic dyes are predominantly used today, and I think this is a significant thing to note, because material change will drive a change in the technique, and a change in the technique will change how a textile looks, feels, or performs. So,
can I ask, are they dyed or painted?
You mean today?
Today, yeah.
So today, because many of the dyes that are used are synthetic, the dyes are painted. So that's a great question, because when people think painted textile historically, they were not painted. They were always dyed textile. It was the modern that was painted. But today, it's actually the dyes that are painted. So there is a big shift in the technique.
While yours are still dyed. I mean, you paint them and you dye them in a bath.
Well, for the reds, they've always been dyed. For blues, I had started painting because I had not yet figured out how to, dye it. But now I'm slowly moving on to actually dyeing the blues and not painting them. So, Peter, do you have anything about the current day Kalamkari? And, would you consider adding something current day Kalamkari to your collection, just because it's a record of, the evolution of Kalamkari?
Yes, I have been as well. Thankfully, they're also much more, the new ones are more affordable. So yeah, I think they're all still part of the story. And,
yes.
I love the idea of imitations and blah, blah, blah. And, and new iterations. And, there might be versions where they're partly dyed, partly screen printed as well. So there might be new hybrid versions as well. I mean, it's all interesting. I think there are a lot of questions for you. Can you see your questions?
No, let me put that on. Yes, Shilpa, would you?
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much, both Renuka and Peter. This is fascinating, and I'm sure we could have gone on for a really long time. But unfortunately, we are at 7:30 already. So just a couple of quick questions from the audience. Kalpana Parikh has asked about the similarities between Ajrak printing and Kalamkari printing, I suppose painting, if there are any.
I guess, as if it is outlines, and I'm not entirely well versed with Ajrak printing, but and I could be wrong about this, but I think in Ajrak printing, the outlines, the similarities would be that the outlines were still printed. Compared to, as well as in Kalamkari, the outlines were also printed. But in Ajrak, a lot of the resist printing is also incorporated, whereas in Kalamkari, resist is not used at all. And of course, similarities between the dyes used.
Great. Okay, Nivedita Rajan asks if all of the production was based in India, or whether there are any stories or at least speculation on whether craftspeople went on to different countries to set up workshops and bases over there. Specifically, I think her reason is, she's kind of looking at how the designs are different for different markets. So also whether these orders were as detailed. Peter, would you like to take that?
Yeah, you know, in the 17th century Dutch records from Batavia or Jakarta, there are reports, government reports on imitation chintzes and the huge fines for them. And even at that time in the 17th century, they could not distinguish between the real and the fake. So, and the fake stuff was being made in Java. So, you know, we might have in museum collections everywhere, copies, contemporary copies from the 17th century that are not Indian. And I think that, to me, that's an equally fascinating part of the story. You know, I showed an 18th century chintz dress that looked like it might have been, I mean, it was sort of echoed or resonant of the work of Chinese brush painting, you know, but, and you just never know. And I think it's also time that we sort of like realize that Kalamkari, the production was probably a network, and we still don't know enough. I mean, there's a little window here which shows that they were made in Java. But by the 19th century, you know, Raffles wrote in Java that people still didn't have the secret behind, you know, a color fast red. So whether they might have made a good copy, but whether everything washed out after the first wash, we don't know. But, you know, when they were sold, they looked good, but, you know, yeah. We know that in Java, they couldn't perfect the red till maybe the middle of the 19th century.
Okay, well, there was a question that I noticed, which was quite specific since you mentioned the red, which was basically asking whether you could talk a little bit about, if you had any kind of, you know, maybe Renuka, you would be better placed to answer that, anything about how the different reds were produced, or if there was some kind of, you know, scientific methodology to it, or just indigenous kind of mode of making those reds?
You know, the process of making the reds was always the same. What changed, because a mordant had to be used with different kinds of matter. But we do know from testing done at various museums that, and this is my hypothesis, is I think any textile that had to be exposed to sunlight for an extended period of time, I think it used shea or what's called shayaware or Oldenlandia ambulata, which is a certain kind of madder dye. And I you know, just because of the coloring compounds in that particular dye had more of alizarin. I know this is a technical question. I think the process is the same, but different reds would have come from different dyes.
Renuka, I remember you showed me a, you know, not like a time chart, but, you know, like how many hours, and you were trying to achieve this sense of the, you know, like a particular red you wanted, and you had to be sort of like, I remember one cloth you had with this amazing.
Yes, so, you know, I had
reds.
this crazy experiment where I had like some 100 different variables. So, you know, to see whether it was the other auxiliaries that went into it, like myrobalan, the kind of water, the kind of dung. You know, this is worth a PhD for sure for somebody.
And you produced a lot of results, right?
Yes, I still have
Different shades of red, yeah.
Yeah.
Just from one dye, and this is not even
just from one dye.
All right. Question from Sindhu Rao. Is there, you know, so in terms of the Kalamkari being a tradition that has been practiced for centuries, with the different kind of techniques and designs, how much of it has been retained? And, you know, would you say that there's been a sort of loss of practices that no longer, you know, there's no knowledge of how it was done before?
Well, I guess it depends how you want to look at it. I mean, some look at it as, you know, Kalamkari evolving. It's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a way of life. But if you want me to comment on how the historic processes have changed, yes, they've definitely changed and I would even say diluted because some of the techniques are not used.
All right, so last question before we close for today, I think. Of all the different markets that Kalamkari was produced for in India, which were the ones that sort of had the most intricate or the most expensive or the most kind of detailed work?
Oh, that's Peter?
Well, I'm biased as I come from Southeast Asia, but no, I think, you know, the main thing is that, you know, the Nusantara, like an island Southeast Asia, and so encompassing Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, etc. I mean, we were sort of at the crossroads of one of the most important, you know, global networks, trade and the whole sort of history of the colonies, the colonial history, and so many things pass through this region, I think. And I think that makes it interesting for Kalamkari history because I found almost examples for all markets somehow incorporated. And I think it also helped that the capital of the Dutch Empire was Batavia or Jakarta. So, you know, everything came through Batavia. And then it sort of like was sold to other smaller markets, and some of it ended up in Japan, etc. So we've been able to find the most incredible things from small islands, and you know, things for the Dutch market can be found in Kalimantan, etc. So, you know, there's so many, all the different styles can be found from the roughest block prints to the finest hand-drawn examples. I think the biggest scale and range comes found in
Peter should to join our ongoing debate because Peter and I have been having this, you know, and we still have not really consensus because I'm very biased towards Western, the students that went into West because that's where I was focused. And it's only recently that, you know, I'm looking at more and more Eastern textiles. And yeah, it's I don't think one can make a...
Yeah, so the one of the things we've discovered is something which, you know, on the surface looks kind of not very fine. It might actually take longer to make than a very fine piece.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if it's double-sided. So, you know, it's just thrown everything upside down again, right?
All right, on this note, I'm going to hand over to Abhishek.
Thank you so much, Renuka and Peter. This was really brilliant to learn so many things about the technique, which I never knew, and so much about some of the pieces in our own collection. So thank you for shedding light on this and taking us through this incredible journey. I wish we had more time, but to be continued. I have one question for you, Peter. Why is it that you don't find great old pieces which were made in India? Why is it that everything went out? You
know, I have a feeling, you know, I was thinking about this, well, just from the Indonesian perspective, but one big advantage for Southeast Asia, and this has been documented by historians, is that, you know, the sumptuary laws were not really observed in Southeast Asia, and people shopped and, you know, consumed beyond their rank and status. And I think that really fueled the market in Southeast Asia. So people who might not have been allowed to buy, you know, at risk on pain of death, were buying very luxurious things in Southeast Asia. And I think this fueled the kind of demand, which maybe because, you know, like in mainland China or in Europe, where people dressed or bought things according, you know, I think there were sumptuary laws were very strict. I believe that had a lot to do with how interesting designs emerged outside, because sumptuary laws were not strict. But the main thing is this ingenuity, and at that time, you know, I think it perhaps for several hundred years, this incredible dynamic society or community and network of people producing all this stuff. you know, it was just magic at a certain time, and the ability to respond so well to what people wanted. Yeah, and maybe because of restrictions inland, I'm not so sure, and I don't know enough about sumptuary laws within India. You know, that could have been a huge part.
Thank you, Peter. And we are looking forward to the Kip Lee collection being shown at MAP sometime. And we're waiting for you to help us with the book. Thank you so much, Peter, Renuka, and all of you for watching.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Renuka. Thank you.